We'll get started in about 2 minutes, but I just wanted to remind our guests that this is the first in a 3-part series of research in brief that we're offering. The second 2 are on the 29th of November and the 6th of December, also at noon Eastern. Today we're going to be talking about a research study called The Relationship Between School Professional Climate and Teacher Satisfaction with the Evaluation Process. We're lucky to have 2 of the researchers from this project here to present, and also a discussant, Scott Harrison from the Maine Department of Education. There will also be some time for Q&A, questions and answers and discussion. And we look forward to hearing all of your valuable insights. This is hosted by the Regional Educational Laboratory, Northeastern Islands, and in particular by the Northeast Educator Effectiveness Research Alliance. You'll hear a little bit about that from Susan Mundry in 1 minute when I hand the baton over to her to launch the webinar. These are our territories. We have several of you. If you wouldn't mind filling out the polls to let us know where you're from, but we seem to have a national representation right now. And our Northeast Educator Effectiveness Research Alliance is one of 8 research alliances, and you can find out more about these alliances if you visit relne.org after this webinar. Right now, I'm going to pass the baton over to Susan Mundry, whose picture you see there, and she will orient you to the bridge event. Welcome, everyone.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Susan. I'm very happy to have you join us for what is our first Research in Brief lunchtime event. As we wrap up the Regional Education Laboratory Northeastern Islands 5-year contract in December, we are bringing to you these, we hope, very relevant short dips into some of our latest research that has all been conducted in collaboration with stakeholders in the Northeast and Islands region. Today, as Reddy has already introduced, we will share with you the research from a study we completed in May of this year that examined the relationship between school professional climate and teacher satisfaction with the evaluation process. This, we will give you an overview of the research study led by Drs. Natalie Lacerino-Paquet and Candace Bocala, who serve as researchers on REL Northeastern Islands, and we'll hear from one of our close collaborators, Scott Harrison, who is a project director at the Maine Department of Education and has been an advisor to the study. And I'll give you an opportunity for questions and discussion. As Rebby mentioned, this is the first of 3 of these mini sessions. The next 2 we'll dig into first on November 29th. The alignment of teacher evaluation and teacher professional learning in a large urban district, another study we've completed recently. And then on December 6th, you'll have the opportunity to learn about another study related to educator effectiveness and evaluation, which examined really looked at how evaluation outcomes varied among teachers by teacher characteristics such as race, ethnicity, age, and gender. So we invite you to register for those follow-on events. And be a part of the entire series. And thank you for joining us today. This event and all of these 3 studies have been done through the Regional Education Laboratory Northeastern Islands Research Alliance, the Northeast Educator Effectiveness Research Alliance. This alliance has been in operation for just about 5 years and has focused on providing research to support our states and districts to both develop and implement educator evaluation systems and build the state's capacity to evaluate their own systems, and have provided lots of timely information to support that work. So we have a short time, so I'm going to go ahead. I did just want to mention that the Northeast Educator Effectiveness Research Alliance, which we call NEERA, has been led for these 5 years by Karen Shackman, who's been the Alliance researcher, and by myself as the Alliance facilitator. And we will work with you today. So, so that we spend most of the time really learning about the study, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Natalie Lacerino-Paquet, to take us through the study findings.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan. I'm pleased to be able to talk with you all today about our study and to have the collaborators, some of the collaborators for the study with me, Candace Bocala, one of the co-authors, and Scott Harrison, who served as an advisory committee member for us and has been with us along the way from when we were conceptualizing the study all the way to its publication. And just to note that that several files from today related to today's presentation, the report and a shortened version of the report, as well as the slides, are available for download in the download window on the web in the Adobe Connect. But first I wanted to really tell you just a little bit about the genesis of the study. The study really came about from the NEERA's research agenda. Each of the research alliances developed a research agenda, and NEERA's was really focused around educator effectiveness and this particular study came about because an earlier study we did in New Hampshire looked at the implementation of an educator evaluation system in SIG schools in New Hampshire. And one of the findings from that study was that implementation seemed to be related to school climate as one potential finding that influenced implementation. And so that led to further questions about, well, you know, what do teachers think about their evaluation systems and about new evaluation systems? And so we decided to explore this question of what are teachers' perceptions of their school professional climate and their satisfaction with their evaluation system. To answer these questions, we used a national data set called Schools and Staffing Survey. These data are available to researchers from the National Center for Education Statistics. We actually used data that at the time was the most recent. It was data from 2011 and 2012, and then 13 and 14. And Schools and Staffing is a set of linked surveys that lets you link teacher responses to school responses to principal responses, and then also includes a little follow-up of a subsample of teachers. So that is the data set that we used. One of the great things about this data set is any questions of interest about teachers' preparation, school practices, professional development that they engage in, as well as their opinion about certain things and their perspectives. Specifically, we were interested in questions that measured school climate and that asked about their evaluation. The sample included over 4,000 teachers, and that represents about 3 million teachers. So it's really a rich data set. I encourage you to look at it for some of your research needs. To examine the questions, we used both descriptive statistics and logistic regression, which is a correlational method. And I'll talk a little bit more about the methods when we talk about the findings. So specifically, we wanted to know to what extent are teachers satisfied with their evaluation? What do they think about school climate? And how do they perceive that relationship between school climate and their evaluation process? Now, school climate, a professional school climate, is a very big concept, and you could measure lots of different aspects of it. We were somewhat limited by the schools and staffing data, and were able to look at what we really see as two constructs of school climate, and that is teachers' influence over school policies and principals' leadership. So that is how we're measuring school climate for this particular study. And what did we find? Well, we found that most teachers reported being satisfied with their evaluation process. Indeed, the great majority, 79%, were either agreed that they were satisfied or strongly agreed with being satisfied with the evaluation process. With regard to our two school climate measures, teachers rated their principal's leadership relatively positively. It was a 4-point scale, with 1 being sort of a low measure, a low sense of principal's leadership, and 4 being a high degree of positivity around their principal's leadership. And on average, teachers rated their principal's leadership as a 3 on that 4-point scale. And those items included things like my principal is supportive, my principal enforces rules of student conduct, my principal communicates a vision for our school. There was a number of different items that were collapsed into a scale to measure teachers' perception of teacher leadership. With influence, it was also a composite variable that combined a number of different items around where teachers report their level of influence. And that teachers rated themselves to have little influence. On a 4-point scale, it was rated on average a 2. And so teachers felt like they didn't have a lot of influence on issues such as setting performance standards, curriculum, professional development, teacher evaluation, as well as hiring and other kinds of school policies. So that was just interesting, descriptive, a snapshot of sort of, given the lay of the land, what is teachers' perception of their principal's leadership and their own influence. When we did the logistic regression, which is a correlational method where we were able to statistically control for a number of different variables. So we were really looking at the relationship between, the one that we really wanted to explore was the school climate variables and teachers' satisfaction with the evaluation system. But we wanted to do that in a way that takes into account things like their differences in the grades their school served, their school size, their teachers' own demographics, whether they were a newer teacher or a more experienced teacher, those types of variables. And what we found was that teachers who rated their principal's leadership more highly on that 4-point scale were more likely to be satisfied with the evaluation process once we controlled for all of these other variables statistically. We also found that teachers who were rated at the highest level on their evaluations last year, that was another one of the variables, is what was your evaluation rating, because we thought if they were rated low, that could influence their satisfaction. If they were rated high, it could influence their satisfaction. And indeed, we saw that controlling for all of the other variables, that teachers who were rated highly on their evaluations in the previous year reported being more likely to be satisfied than teachers who are rated at lower levels. And then another variable that we included that was particularly of interest in the changing realm of educator evaluation policies was we were able to include a variable that indicated whether student test scores were included in a teacher's evaluation. And indeed, this was found to be significant as well, and in the direction that we would expect, that teachers who reported their students' test scores or growth measure were included in their evaluation, they reported being less satisfied with their evaluation process than were other teachers. So I'm going to turn the phone over to Candace Bocala, or the mic over to Candace Bocala, who will help us think a little bit about what these findings mean.
Thank you so much, Natalie. So in terms of implications for those people who have been working in schools, the findings are not in and of themselves surprising, but it is important that research does validate some of the conditions that we assume to be true. For example, the idea that principal leadership is important, it just reinforces and underscores the nature that the principal really does create conditions that can lead to teachers being satisfied with a process such as educator evaluation. And then it does generate more questions for further research and also for practice about how do we think about educator satisfaction with the evaluation system given different factors of the school's professional climate? So what's interesting is the student test scores question occurred in fairly early on when states were just starting to adopt new evaluation systems that included test scores or included student achievement or growth. So this was in 2011, 2012. It would be interesting to re-examine the extent to which the student test scores still are associated with teachers being less satisfied. Is that finding still true today? It could be true that previously the systems had just started and they weren't fully implemented when the study was conducted. Another question that we have is teachers generally rated themselves pretty low on having influence in their schools. It was a really interesting finding and somewhat surprising to us that teacher influence was not associated with satisfaction, but if we were to redo that now as states are increasing their input from teachers in evaluation systems, would that finding still be the same? So in order to reflect on some of these questions and also to talk about what he is seeing in the field, I'd like to turn it over to Scott Harrison, who, as Natalie mentioned, was our advisory committee member, and he is with Maine Schools for Excellence.
Thank you, Candace. Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. My name is Scott Harrison, and I'm the Director of Maine Schools for Excellence at the Maine Department of Education. MSFE is an umbrella initiative funded by 2 Teacher Incentive Fund grants covering 10 districts and 45 high-need schools from across our state. Premised on the belief that the quality of a school cannot exceed the quality of its people, and the quality of its people cannot exceed the quality of the systems in place to get, grow, and keep good people, our MSFE districts have taken a strategic human capital approach to this work. The goal is to create an integrated and coherent set of human resource programs and supports that enable a district to cultivate a workforce of high-performing teachers and leaders who are not just aligned in purpose and teamed in their efforts, but also motivated to advance and excel in delivering the highest quality instruction to all students. The graphic that you see here represents the major chunks of work in which we've been focused the past few years. Our entry into this work started with the development of the Evaluation Professional Growth Program for Teachers and Leaders, and the professional practice frameworks that anchor this Evaluation Professional Growth Program were built from scratch and based on the National Board Standards for Accomplished Teaching and Leadership. These same practice standards are woven into and across all our other work, including the other bubbles in that graphic there: recognition and reward, school environment, educator preparation, and employment. Needless to say, the questions in this study that we've been talking about cover several of these areas. Take the 79% satisfaction with the evaluation process. Our first reaction to this was that 79% satisfaction seemed high. From the trenches, we're accustomed to hearing more complaints than compliments about this work. So seeing this finding caused us to want to revisit our own data from our annual project evaluation survey. So looking back 2 years ago, we found that 60% of our teachers reported that they were at least somewhat satisfied with what we call the TPEG, the Teacher Evaluation and Professional Growth Program. Last year, 81% reported that they were at least somewhat satisfied with their TPEG. So we saw some progress. You know, this exercise gave us, a little something to celebrate in this work. So the 79% finding was interesting, but it also left us wanting more information, as Candace alluded to, on which parts of the evaluation process are teachers more or less satisfied, which is something to consider should the study be replicated in the future. So other study findings that piqued our interest and also validated some key assumptions of our work the past few years was, and they've already been talked about a little bit, the finding that teacher perceptions of their principal's effectiveness are positively associated with teacher satisfaction with the evaluation process. We had a couple of reactions to this. One, it makes perfect sense. If teachers like their principal, it stands to reason that they too will like the evaluation process. And also, it'd be great if additional research could explore some causal relationships here between these two variables. As an aside, like before, we left this finding again wanting to dig deeper into our own data to compare our key tag satisfaction scores in each of our schools with the summary ratings on the annual school leadership 360 survey that we do. The second finding that piqued our interest was the teacher summative evaluation rating is related to how the teacher feels about their evaluation process. In other words, teachers receiving high marks tend to be more satisfied with the evaluation process than those teachers receiving low evaluation ratings. This too makes perfect sense and validates our current working assumptions. Again, we think that there's opportunity here for further research that drills down a bit deeper into variables such as the satisfaction with the evaluation process construct, so just so we can better understand and flesh out all the different components of the evaluation process that teachers are more or less satisfied. So the study also raised a couple of questions for us, and one of them was the finding that teachers with test scores included in their evaluation system are less likely to be satisfied with the evaluation process. On the one hand, this finding does not surprise us given the controversy around this issue and the political hot potato that use of test scores has become. We wonder, however, if the findings on this question would be any different for teachers using SLOs. We use the SLO approach for measuring student growth, and given the greater degree of influence that teachers have over this measure, we would predict a positive rather than a negative association between these two variables, at least in those districts where the SLO process is blown and going and in full swing. So I would say that the questions posed in this study are highly relevant and meaningful to our human capital work. More research has been discussed in this area to identify correlations and ideally causations between and among these important variables would be really helpful to the field, especially important given the pressure that I think legislators will continue to face to water down the standards and weaken the foundational performance system that all districts have been working so hard the past few years to create. I guess in summary, I just want to say it's been a pleasure to be involved in this work, and hats off to Candace and Jessica for this research. It's great stuff, and we look forward to part 2.
Thank you so much, Scott. I think that the adding the flavor from Maine and what you're seeing in Maine is very helpful. And I just had a question for you. In measuring your own teacher satisfaction with the TEP-GP system there in Maine, how did you do that? Was that through a survey, or how did you measure the satisfaction?
So we're required by the grant to do an annual project and program evaluation survey, and so the survey is really dense. There are a ton of questions on it, but one of those questions is, to what degree are you satisfied with your TPAG program, Teacher Evaluation Professional Growth Program, and it asks the same question, around the LEAPAG program, the leadership program, and the recognition and reward program, and the SLO program. So that's where we're getting the data.
And how are you using that data?
Well, after we conduct the survey, we dig into that data, and we have, each year of the grant to try to figure out, where the opportunities for improvement are, both from a project management standpoint and a program implementation standpoint. Some of the things that these surveys are just fodder for rolling up your sleeves and really diving in, having good dialogue, and thinking about ways to move the needle on school improvement. And so, across all aspects of this work, we've relied on the feedback from the field to help us in that way.
Thank you. So we have a few questions related to sort of how we measured the satisfaction of teachers for the study. Jason is asking what measures or language was used to determine 79% were satisfied. Natalie, would you or Candace take that question?
Yes, that's a great question. And we realize in these research and brief, we really, in a way, give a very high-level sense of the findings. But I will tell you what the wording is, and also let you know that the full wording can also be found in the in the reports. But in the schools and staffing survey, the question asked to what extent you agree or disagree, and then it lists with each of the following statements, and then there was a few statements about your formal, so it's the extent to which you agree or disagree with each of the following statements about the formal evaluation of your work as a teacher last school year. And one of the items was, I was satisfied with the formal evaluation process. And it was indeed a 4-point scale, which in the pie chart we showed the responses to all 4 categories. But when we did the logistic regression, we had to make it a variable with 2 response categories, a dichotomous variable, and collapse the agree, strongly agree categories and the somewhat disagree and strongly disagree categories.
Great, thank you, Natalie. And I guess this whole question of satisfaction with the system is one that we've been thinking about since we started this work a few years back. It seems almost just a very predictable that teachers with higher ratings would be satisfied, teachers that maybe don't feel like they've had the student measures used, especially in some sort of a high-stakes system, and that those who are who really highly favorable about their leader would tend to trust that person's judgment and be more favorable. I'm wondering, what are some of the other factors that might affect teacher satisfaction with their evaluation systems? And if those of you on the call have some ideas about that, would you put it in the chat? What do you see as factors that affect teacher satisfaction with the evaluation systems? And I wonder if, Candace, you want to reflect on that a little bit.
This is Candace. I think there are some questions that we didn't get to ask because of the limits of what is available on the schools and staffing survey. But for example, it could be really interesting to know whether teachers who have received more professional learning opportunities to understand the evaluation system, or professional learning opportunities to, for example, write student learning objectives, are therefore more satisfied with the system. It speaks to the need for teachers to not only teachers who are participating in the system be given the opportunity to learn about it. So that's a question. I'm sure that our participants may have other factors that might come into play from their experience, and if you do, please put those in the chat.
Yes, I think in our earlier study of the implementation of the educator evaluation system in New Hampshire, one of the factors we found is that the newest part of the system, implementing the student learning objectives, was really the one where people felt the least comfortable. And it's potentially thinking about satisfaction may be related to really how well implemented and how comfortable people are feeling about the full implementation of the system. And I think in terms of follow-up research, as Scott mentioned, it would be great to really drill down more into what can we learn from both this research, but also what does tend to, other factors that impact teachers' satisfaction with their educator evaluation systems, such as training, leadership, school, other factors in school climate. And would you reflect a little more on how the school staffing survey might be other questions that could be explored around to do some follow-up research? Candace or Natalie?
Yeah, no, those are some great questions. And, I think the schools and staffing survey in this particular iteration did not ask a lot of questions about evaluation and didn't even necessarily ask teachers a lot about what their principals are doing. But I must say that as a researcher, I'm pretty excited that schools and staffing survey is being reconfigured. It should be coming out relatively soon, a new version of it that I think will be adjusted to ask more questions about current policy issues or recent policy issues, much more so than it was in 2011, 2012, which was basically a repeat of the survey in 2007, 2008. And they're also changing it to be longitudinal to be able to track individual teachers over time. I think Candace mentioned that this is sort of like a snapshot in time when she was talking about some of the implications. So I think that will be really, really important for researchers and people interested in exploring sort of at state levels or national levels implications of policy on teachers and principals and schools and being able to track that. So I think to some extent some of the implications are further follow-up are still to come a little bit once we see what those new surveys are like. I see that we do actually have, Susan, and a couple of other questions, but I just wanted to, well, yes, I'll maybe take another question, and I want to make sure that we leave time to have Rebby close us at the end and send us off. But Amy asked a question that I thought Scott might also have some thoughts about, and that is the importance of teacher satisfaction in an evaluation process, given that these evaluation systems have been somewhat imposed, and whether teacher satisfaction really is important in this process. So Scott, I don't know if you have any initial thoughts in the 30 seconds we have left.
Boy, it's a loaded question. I love that question, and it's a tough one. I think, I guess my reaction to the question was it took me back to the importance of fairness as a social being. You know, fairness in this process called evaluation is really crucial. And what are the ingredients to a fair and sensible system? You know, there are a lot of pieces to it, I think, and you know, are the evaluations being done you know, consistently at the organization? Are the measures that undergird the evaluation system, are they reliable? I mean, measurement is the cornerstone of any high-performing organization and fuels not only evaluation but other human resource programs. So making sure that measurement is sound is very key. But I'm not answering the question around satisfaction, but satisfaction will be a natural, you know, a result of a system that is perceived as fair and equitable and anchored in precise measurement.
Thank you, Scott. I'm going to turn it over to Rebby.
I just want to thank you all for joining us for the first of 3 research briefs. Please join us again on the 29th of November and take a moment to give us your feedback on the event. And we use it to improve future events, so we would really love to hear from you. Thanks so much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.